welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we are coming off of Father's Day weekend, and Ken and I both happen to be fathers, and coincidentally happen to have fathers as well. Some of the things that he and I both have in common. And we thought that it might be a good idea to talk about fathers. What does it mean? Talk about it in the context of good fathers, the father heart of God, and in the context of prayer, as we pray for folks who typically deal with father wounds. So Ken, have I got this right in my notes here? You are a father as well?
Last I checked, yes.
And I know a few of your kids, and they're great people. In fact, I think you and I have had conversations multiple times about because your children are grown, mine are young, pretty young, and so you and I both had conversations about how did you do it, because your kids turned out pretty great and love the Lord and are doing well. And so I think you may not be the expert on fathering, but you're not a bad example. So I'm excited to talk to you about this.
Well, I think I'm probably an example of the grace of God as far as it comes to fathering, because my own father was out of the house about, maybe I was 2.5 years old, maybe as old as 3, but he was gone. My parents divorced for reasons we won't go into now. And he died when I was 4. And so I literally only have 2 memories of my earthly father. And so I did not come easily to fatherhood. When Beth and I were going to get married, we talked about, children and how many we thought we wanted. And we seemed to have a consensus. And once we were in the marriage, I was not too excited about the responsibilities of fatherhood. I was concerned that I had no idea what to do as a father. And it took me a while, which is why we didn't have our first child until 7 years after we were married, which is normally a long time. Most people have kids within a couple of years of getting married. So yes, our children have turned out well, and I'm very happy for the way they've turned out. I wish I could take credit for it, but I think it really was the grace of God. There were things that I learned along the way from my grandfather, who became my surrogate father in many ways, and also from a few spiritual mentors, pastors, and the Word of God itself, just reading it and understanding what is expected of a father. What does good fathering look like? What does it not look like? So somehow in all that, I guess I pulled it off. But it would be interesting if we had my daughters on the show for them to talk about what it was like growing up with me. I would almost be like, be nice to me. I did my best. I tried hard to be a good father, but I literally didn't have models. It was a very overwhelming experience for me.
Well, and I would also say too, in knowing your wife, I think she probably helped that a lot.
Yep, she did. Yeah. Although she didn't really have a very good father figure either. And her father died, I can't remember how old she was, 10 or 12. And it says in one of the kings, and I can't remember which one it was in the Bible, he passed away to no one's regret. Mm-hmm. And I think that really is a fair statement of Beth and her father, because of the kind of man that he was. So neither of us really came from healthy fathering situations, which I guess, we might as well begin this broadcast on a point of hope. The point of hope is, no matter how bad it was for you, it doesn't need to be that bad when you have children, if you will walk in the ways of the Lord. If you just model everything that you saw, it may not go so well.
Right.
And so, as with everything in life, it really pays for us to lean in consciously to the right ways of God.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's something too in that, being able to break that cycle which is not always the case. In fact, most statistically speaking, it's not the case where
Yeah.
those from broken homes. And again, by the grace of God, I think you guys were able to do that as well, which is exciting, and it should
Yeah.
give people hope that, and that's what we do a lot when we break generational iniquity, and we deal with the roots of things that have come through. I mean, there is hope for all of that.
That's right.
And so not only can the Lord heal, sickness that may have been passed down, but he can also heal the things of broken families that have been passed down.
That's right.
And there's a lot of hope in that as well.
Right.
Yeah, no, just in thinking about in fathering and in this conversation, I think there's more often than not, in who's going to be listening in, just based on statistics, most people will probably resonate with father wounds more than the stereotypical wonderful father that they have. And so maybe we can start with some of the negative things that people have experienced because of fathering. And really, Ken, I would love to hear your thoughts on, even before we get into that, on the importance of a father in people's lives, and in the weight that it carries, in the representation, because I think some people might not understand how crucial and integral it is into the development of healthy human beings.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. Some of our listeners would remember back a few years now to the presidency of George Bush, not George W. Bush, but his father. I believe he was known as Bush 41. And he had a vice president named Dan Quayle, who no one has heard from for many years. He became the vice president. And George Bush famously said, if you want to know what the future of America looks like, watch who I pick for my vice president. And Quayle was a relatively young vice president. He was immediately mocked and ridiculed. He came from Indiana. And I remember during that administration, at one point, Dan Quayle got into a huge, well, today it would be a social media war, but we didn't have social media back in those days. But it blew up in the regular media. It was in all the papers. It was on TV over an episode of what was at the time a sitcom called Murphy Brown. And in this episode of Murphy Brown, she decided to go out and get pregnant, with no intention of marrying the man, because she wanted to have a kid. And so Dan Quayle was basically saying, this is immoral. It's not right. Fathers are important. And out of that whole, episode, we might say battle or engagement of the culture wars, came the notion that men are not much good for anything except to be sperm donors. And if we could get sperm anywhere else, we wouldn't even need to have men on the earth. And so that idea, I think, has really advanced since that time. And even if people don't actually say it, although you may have heard it, maybe not you, Grant, but I mean, people on this who are listening to us, it's in the air and it's in the water. There is very much this idea that men are dispensable. They don't really add much. And I think a lot of this comes out of the idea of what is these days called toxic masculinity, because there are a lot of men who, well, they're men, all right, biologically and, physically they're men. But they don't always embody, I mean, we could say it many different ways, but how about let's just say they don't embody good manners. The things that they do, the ways in which they communicate, they can be very coarse, uncouth, at times brusque or abrupt. And I think this has been, to a great extent, part of the defining characteristic of masculinity for many centuries. And in earlier times, people kind of put up with it because what else were you going to do? Right. But in Western democracies like America, we believe in the equality of all people, irrespective of whether they're men or women. And with that, a lot of the behaviors that maybe people were willing to overlook once upon a time, they are no longer willing to overlook. And I'm not sure that's entirely bad. I think there is a need for better behavior among men than there has been. And that's going to bleed over not only into their relationships with women of their age, it may reflect in their relationships with their mothers or their sisters, and it's going to reflect in their relationships with their children. So toxic masculinity is there's no one firm definition of it. It's almost self-defining. It's masculinity that it's not healthy. It could be poisonous. And I think some of the features of it, I don't know, maybe we can bounce back and forth here, but I mean, men who have explosive tempers, men who resort to some form of physical violence to solve, well, almost anything. And so it may begin with beating the wife, but it may move on to beating the children or kicking the dog or, whatever. So anger out of control would be another symptom of this, I think. Toxic masculinity may include belittling or maybe mocking as an attempt to try to get kids to perform better. But actually, part of what fathering should do is to call people to a higher level rather than forcing them into it through shame and manipulation. So all of this with Murphy Brown and all that, this was some of the early part of the culture wars. And, for the record, the presidency of George H.W. Bush, was 2001 through 2009. So we're approximately 20 years beyond that interval. And I would say, the things that were being discussed then are still being discussed now, except probably the intensity of the culture wars has heated up and things are far more vitriolic than they were at that time. So Dan Quayle was calling out Murphy Brown for something that in his mind, and I would add, biblically speaking, it was in fact immoral. So I'm not taking issue with what Dan Quayle said. I'm not sure that solving that in a public forum, the equivalent of social media today, I'm not sure that's the right place to do it. But anyway, Dan Quayle did this. But what is this thing that we call toxic masculinity? There's no one definition to it. It's just a term that gets bandied about. And actually, in many ways, it probably doesn't need a definition, but it's a series of behaviors, perhaps attitudes, personality traits that are viewed as somehow offensive or toxic. And so there's a lot of things that this could include. It could include domestic violence, which might include assaults on either mom or the children or both. Sometimes fathers discriminate and only attack, one or the other. So it might include domestic violence. It could include things that are, I think everybody knows adultery is not a good thing. The world tends to turn its eyes away and kind of wink at it because they don't want to pass moral judgments on anything, but certainly within the church or within any sort of traditional culture, the idea of adultery, this is not acceptable. It could include trying to shame the children into particular kinds of performance profiles, get good grades. Why'd you only get a B+? Can't you do better? That sort of thing. It could include criticizing and joking with making mom or the children the brunt of the joke. And with that, humor stops being fun. It stops being funny. So that might be another aspect of toxic masculinity. I don't know, Grant, I don't want to monopolize it here. What else do you think of? You do a lot of counseling and you see a lot of men and you see a lot of people who've been impacted by their fathers. What are some other traits of toxic masculinity?
Yeah, a lot of it deals with, essentially looking down at women in a lot of different ways and seeing them as lesser. That also seeing things that seem, maybe stereotypically effeminate as, could be anything as far as occupation or anything like that, that might be deemed something that would be done by a woman would be, if a man was doing it, it might be viewed as shameful. That those are sort of toxic views and exaggerated views of masculinity. And so it affects men and women. You know, you can men can be affected by toxic masculinity from other men. Most of the time, it's directed at women. That I've seen in all kinds of abuse, and not just abuse, but just the general looking down at them for being somehow less capable, less intelligent, less important.
So we could call that male superiority and or misogyny.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Keep going. I'm just trying to summarize it for.
Right. And and then, like you're saying, any sort of exaggerated male tendencies, violence, hypersexuality, seeing women as objects, all of those sort of things typically come into the toxic masculinity bucket, and is certainly not a healthy trait for men. And it creates, it perpetuates different things. For example, a lot of times it'll do a lot of peer pressure with men. If you have a toxic male, toxic masculine, man, and other, it could be brothers or sons or friends. A lot of times it has a lot of negative influence on them in forms of peer pressure and all of that sort of stuff. Sort of stereotypical, 80s bad guy type people, 80s movies, the bad guy from Karate Kid, the bad guy from all of those is kind of just summed up into that toxic masculinity thing.
When I think of toxic masculinity, one of the people who immediately comes to mind is again a sitcom character. I think I was in high school maybe when this was on TV, but All in the Family and Archie Bunker.
Mm-hmm.
He used to call his son-in-law meathead. He was very demeaning towards his wife Edith, and of course they typecasted her within the show to make her look like a dingbat, and he called her dingbat. I'm not saying it's okay, but I mean they didn't give him any help in typecasting her that way. He was quite classically a racist with the kinds of things that he would say. And certainly by the standards of today, you would never say the kinds of things that Archie Bunker said. But this was sitcom, and people watched it and laughed at it. So he would be an example of somebody who is a toxic male. Can you think of anyone else from either TV or movies that might embody this?
Yeah, the Al Bundy type character. That sort of thing.
But most people aren't living with Al Bundy, right? They might have lived with an Archie Bunker.
Right. Not Ted Bundy.
Okay. Right. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, certainly psychopaths and serial killers would fall into that bucket as well. But just any sort of your typical 80s, 90s movie, The Bully, is pretty much all of that. The hypersexualization, the objectification of women, all of that sort of stuff is really sort of summed up into it. And so there's even, what's interesting. I heard someone, they were wanting to show their son, a movie. I think it was 16 Candles. Remember that movie? It was pretty popular, and they were pretty excited about it because they thought it was a great movie. And as their, the current son was watching it, it became very apparent how much it kind of glossed over and made light of things like date rape and all of these other things that we now take a lot more seriously. And you can really start to see how that has infiltrated a lot of the culture going back, and then how we've sort of changed our tolerances of what we tolerate.
Yeah.
Now, and I think most of it's to the good, honestly. I mean, I think it'd be hard pressed to have an argument of how that's negative. I think where we get in trouble is, and what I actually looked it up on Urban Dictionary just to see what their definition of toxic masculinity was, similar to what we were talking about. But what they did say, and I think what happens, and I think this is sort of the issue, is that there's a large group of thought that thinks doesn't know there's a difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity. And so that even is what Urban Dictionary said, is that there is actually a difference between toxic masculinity and just plain old masculinity. And I think that's where a lot of the issues are right now, is that everyone is assuming that all masculinity is toxic.
I think that's a really good point to make. Someone was telling me about a sermon that a well-known preacher gave just a few days ago on Father's Day. And I'm sure this got garbled in transmission, or at least I hope it got garbled in transmission. But anyway, this particular pastor apparently said that according to the American Psychological Association, the APA, they now define masculinity as a mental illness. And when I was told this, I said, I'm sure that something has been lost here. They must mean toxic masculinity, not all masculinity. I mean, there is some possibility that it is all masculinity that is the way they've written it up, because there are some strange things going on in the psychological community and in the American culture right now. But I would like to think that cooler heads prevailed and they mean toxic masculinity. But in any case, this is now being mentioned and talked about within the psychological community as being serious enough because of the problems that it creates in people who are subjected to it. And, all of this actually makes for a very interesting point. We are both Christians, and this is a Christian podcast. And, we have to think about, what do the things of Scripture and of our current cultural concerns, how do those impact us in our faith? And so I think we could look at certain characters within the Bible, and we unfortunately might label some of them as toxically masculine. I don't think Solomon started out that way, but by the end of his life, he appears to have been some sort of sex addict. He had 300 wives and 700 concubines. Arguably, Solomon became a toxic individual. Maybe he was one all along. We like to think of David as he's called the man after God's own heart, which I think means, his sentiments were to do right and to honor God and to love God. But the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, this is definitely not a high point. And I think, as we've defined it, at least in that time frame, it wasn't just one incident, but in that collection of incidents that occurred in that interval of time, David was behaving in a toxic way. And we could probably think about some others. Joab, the commander of David's army, he was a very good general, but there were some things that Joab did that were they were morally wrong, but we could also say they were very offensive. And again, this toxic masculinity. So we see snapshots of it. I don't think the Bible endorses any of these things. And in David's case in particular, he is explicitly rebuked by the prophet Nathan, the prophet of the Lord, for doing what he did. So it's clear God's not in favor of it. But we do have to recognize that this is something that's been a fixture for a long time. And as we are now in the few days after Father's Day, there would be some people who really struggle with the notion of fatherhood, are not excited about it at all, because they themselves have been, in one way or another, brutalized or harmed by their own fathers.
Yeah, I love the Scriptures in that it doesn't try to sugarcoat, even the the worst parts of the best heroes and all of that sort of thing. But yeah, there's considerable examples, and it has been a traditionally male-dominated culture since the beginning of everything. And I think that has a lot to do with it as well in a lot of the criticism and critiques that we hear about just masculinity in general, is that pretty much most of all the wars and all of those sort of things have been male driven. And there
have been a few exceptions, though.
Few exceptions, but pretty much
Mary, Queen of Scots.
Right. But the majority of things throughout human history
Yeah.
Have been very male dominant, and most of the time hasn't been that kind towards women. And so I think there's this continued, as we're trying to culturally break free of some of the old mindsets, which I think are fine, to expose our inherent racism issues, our inherent sexism issues, and all of those sort of things. I think in that vein, the masculinity has sort of risen to the top of the heap, so to speak.
Yeah. All right. Well, so I think we understand what toxic masculinity, what some of the markers of it are. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. So to our listeners, if you don't think we did a good enough job covering it, please forgive us. We're doing our best here, and we're trying to keep it all within a certain interval of time.
Also, it's not what we're talking about today. This isn't a podcast about toxic masculinity.
Right.
It's about
trying to lay a baseline. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So on the other side of it, we have, let's say, masculinity, which is as it's meant to be. And, what is good masculinity? Now, I already said my father was off the scene very early on. And, maybe in kind of a strange way. I mean, I think all of us need our fathers, but from the things I have heard about my father, I am not sure that he wasn't toxic in his own way. Again, I never really knew him. I only have 2 memories of him. Both of them, by the way, are good memories, so that's a positive thing. But I can't really comment on him. My grandfather was a role model for me, and I think in many ways he embodied some very good traits that we would want to have. He showed me many things, taught me many things, and I don't mean like said, go read this book, or he didn't just tell me things, although he did tell me things. He showed me how to do them. He showed me how to bait a hook and go fishing. He showed me how to shoot a gun. And for some people, that's toxic in its own regard, but I don't think guns per se are toxic. There was a time not too long ago in America where part of the rite of passage of becoming a man was to learn how to handle a firearm responsibly. And, I would say in that vein, I know, Grant, you enjoy shooting, and we have a number of friends that we have in common who are hunters and shooters. In this entire circle of people, I don't think any of us has ever shot anyone, not even by accident. We've never shot up a school. We've never used a gun to settle a dispute. None of us have done any time for firearms related crimes. So guns per se do not automatically make you toxic. And in fact, in that time, I can remember with my grandfather when he was showing me his rifles and his shotguns. He wasn't much into pistols, so we didn't do much there. But he would always say, now be careful with this. Be sure you don't point it at anything. In his own language, he was teaching me what we today call the 4 rules of safety for firearms. I didn't know that's what he was doing. He just inculcated it into me. And, he told me, you don't point guns at people, and you don't use guns to settle disputes. Guns are for hunting, and you have to be a responsible hunter. You don't just shoot anything you see. You shoot the animal you want to shoot. So you pick that animal. And once you've killed it, you clean it properly and you eat the meat. You don't just shoot animals wantonly. You do it with the objective that you will use their flesh, just as you would use beef or chicken or whatever. So I say all of that, and it's a bit of an excursus, but because I know there are some people who would be triggered by the mere mention of guns, especially with the things that have been going on in our country of late with some of the school shootings and other things, I don't want people to think that we're endorsing that kind of behavior. But anyway, so my grandfather taught me things about God the Father. And I don't just mean by his own example now. I mean, he taught me things that were in the Bible, as did my grandmother. He explained to me things about the Christian faith. When I was a boy and I would be with him, it wasn't actually that much in the past when Native Americans were roaming around, in Western Michigan, maybe not with a homeland that had been given to them, but they weren't necessarily living in houses as the predominantly white population of Western Michigan did. But every now and then you would see somebody. Now, this is before my time, just to be clear, but it wasn't that much before my time. And so with all of that, there were still arrowheads lying about. And if you knew how to find them, you could. And so my grandfather and I spent a lot of time hunting, prospecting for arrowheads, Indian arrowheads, as they were called at that time. In the sands of along Lake Michigan or around some of the lakes and in the woods and so forth. And so I learned to be attentive, to look for things that were of some value that you might not have even noticed. All of these things I learned from my grandfather. My grandfather used to tell me how much he cared about me, that he loved me, how much he believed in me. And in that sense, I would say he called me to my destiny. That's language of the 21st century. Definitely was not in use in my boyhood. But the point is, he helped me believe in myself, and he helped me have confidence that if I took something on, whether it was, I don't know, climbing a tree or throwing a rock at something, that I might actually hit it. But he gave me some sense of confidence and some knowledge of who I was. And I would say that that influence was so profound in my life that years later, when I was a teenager and I was being tempted by the things that tempt teenagers, on more than one occasion, I would stop what I was doing as I was kind of tracking towards bad behavior. And I would say to myself, I can't do this. I'm John Walbert's grandson. It would dishonor his name. So these are some things that I have memories of that I would think are healthy masculinity, as opposed to toxic masculinity. I could tell some others too. I remember seeing my grandfather wrap his arms around my grandmother, and not in some inappropriate way, hey, baby, let's get it on right here in front of our grandson. It wasn't anything like that. It was just very affectionate and kind. And, he would like that. And, he would kiss her on the cheek. Now and then they would kiss on the lips, but mostly they didn't do that in front of me. He would compliment her on her meals. And, he did his part around the house. Now, it was a more traditional family. My grandfather was born at the end of the 1800s. My grandmother was born in 1902, at the very beginning of the 1900s. So, we're talking a century gone and more. But when I was involved with them, they were, in their 60s and 70s. But so my grandmother, she played a more traditional role. She did the house cleaning, she did the cooking. But my grandfather took care of their garden. My grandfather mowed the lawn. My grandfather repaired things that were broken. My grandfather painted the house. He trimmed the trees when they needed trimming. He did all of these things too. And I would say this is the side of, when it says Adam was put into the garden to tend the garden. Well, all of these are tending type functions, whether or not it has to do specifically with a garden. They did have one. They raised all their own vegetables. They had a huge raspberry patch. And so I used to pick raspberries with my grandfather. I learned all of these things from him, not even so much because he told me, he just modeled them out. And with that, I understood what it meant to be, what a man should be and what a husband should do. And, as I say, I'm not sure if my father had lived, if he would have modeled all this for me based on what I understand of him. But certainly with my grandfather, I got a lot of imprinting that went on, and it was very helpful for me. So anyway, Grant, what you do a lot of counseling, you do a lot of inner healing. What are some of the things that you think of when you think of healthy masculinity?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in talking about it because, obviously about 50% would be dealings with fathers as a daughter standpoint, right? Mm-hmm. And the other as a son. And those two need similar things and different things from fathers. But that father sort of exhibiting, the healthy masculinity of being able to take risks, of being able to be bold, to stand up for what's right, for those sort of things, to be able to cope with failure, with things that might go wrong. How do you cope with things that go bad in your life?
Yep.
All of those sort of examples typically tend to come from the father role. A lot of the self-esteem, a lot of the stability, a lot of that sort of thing typically comes from the father role as well. A lot of calling, a lot of destiny, a lot of most of that comes from that father role, not always, and so there's certainly situations, and I'll tell you this as I'm even talking about this, one of the coolest things I've seen the Lord do, because not everyone is afforded the opportunity of a father. Even I've talked with single moms that have raised kids, raised men, and have raised good men and raised good daughters. There's this grace that the Lord gives them as well to be able to impart a lot of those things too. So it's not as though you're necessarily damned to a poor existence if you happen to be a single mother that's trying to raise their kids. The Lord can intervene and do some pretty miraculous things to that. So we don't want to make it sound like you're out of luck on that. It is considerably harder, but the typical scenario, a lot of that stuff comes from the father to that. And so then obviously the inverse of the lack of those things, and you get a lot of your even how do you show compassion to those that are weaker than you? How do you treat those that might be less fortunate? A lot of that also comes from the fathering role as well. A lot of the toxic things will be you dominate, you do those sort of things, but a lot of how do you treat people comes from a fathering role.
On that point, here's another story about my grandfather and grandmother, but this one was more driven by him. So when I was a boy, because of my father's death, my mother would send me to live with them for months at a time. Bottom line, she couldn't afford to keep me, so I would live with them. And there was a family that lived across the street from my grandparents, and there was a family that lived next door to them. And both of them had boys in the family who were about my age. The one across the street actually was a very large family, but being a very large family, some of the kids were either much older than I was or much younger, so they weren't really appropriate playmates for me. I guess we have to be careful with that word because that word's been redefined as well. But by this, I just mean when boys play together in a non-sexual way with other boys, doing boy stuff, climbing trees and whatever. Okay. So anyway, and then the kid next door, he had an older brother who had, I guess, moved out by the time I was there. So I hung out with these two boys, one across the street, one next door, quite a bit. And in those years in Michigan, air conditioning wasn't really common. You just opened the windows and let the breeze blow, and that was as cool as it got. Maybe you'd set up a fan and somehow you got through it. Anyway, so in that context, my grandparents would often hear these other two boys and me playing as we, chased around the house or played in the yard or hit balls or whatever we were doing. And I will just say this, these other two boys were raised in families where they used language to refer to other races that I was not accustomed to hearing. We certainly didn't use it. So I had no modeling for it. And one day I came in for dinner, which for us, dinner was always at noontime because my grandparents had a farm. And then we had what we called supper in the evening about 5 o'clock. It was a lighter meal. And so things were kind of reversed from what we commonly think of in today's world. Anyway, so I came in for dinner at midday, and we sat down at the table, and my grandfather looked at me and he said, "I know what those boys are saying." And he said, "I just want to be clear about one thing." He said, "If I ever hear you use any of that language," and I'm not talking about profanity, I'm talking about racial epithets, right, of the, referring to others. He said, "You will be given the belt and you will be sent to bed for a week without dinner." He said, "Is that clear?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Good. I'm glad we have that straight." But, it laid a baseline for me that it was not okay to behave that way. and that there would be penalties if I did. And then my grandmother, she was a Bible teacher and a well-known one. And she looked at me and she said, all of the people of the earth are God's children, and their skin color doesn't matter. And so we have to treat all people as though they are the same. And we don't care about what color they are, nor do we care about what their, today we would say, socioeconomic status. I don't remember how she said it, but I think she said, we don't care if they're rich or poor. But bottom line, treat everybody well because they're all made in the image of God. This was what my grandmother added to that conversation. And so I just understood these are the rules of the road. And that was all led by my grandfather, who was my surrogate father. Again, this is the kind of thing that a positive fatherly image or a role model or father figure can instill in the life of somebody. And it exactly tracks to what you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, what we haven't said yet, because it's obvious, but just to state the obvious, in some way, what we perceive from our earthly fathers will be the lens that we are able to relate or not relate to our heavenly Father. And often that creates an issue that we need to address pastorally as people are trying to understand how do they see God as the Father. The word Father might not be a positive term. It might not be an applicable term. It might be a neutral term, and so much of what, as we're, in our church, in our families, what we're trying to do is we're trying to model as best we can what it's like for us to have a relationship with God the Father. That's the ideal. Now we'll fail, and that's normal. And then we'll talk about grace with our kids and apologize and all of that sort of thing. But the goal is that we don't want to set up any sort of stumbling blocks for them to be able to relate as Jesus teaches us to, as our Father. That's our primary relation with Him that He speaks of. And so, I think this would be a good time to sort of transition into, as yours has been far more prolific than mine, and mine has mostly been from learning from yours. In your ministry context, if you just had to shoot from the hip, how much of what you do with people as you're taking them through inner healing, through deliverance, through something, how much of that has to do with father wounds, with absence of fathers, of all of that? Just spitballing. We're not gonna quote you on this, but would you say, a lot?
Probably around a third,
Yeah.
plus or minus a bit, maybe as low as a quarter, maybe as much as 40%. I don't think it's as high as half, because we also have people who deal with mother wounds, which are a different category. And then there are people who have damage that didn't come from their parents. They got, roughed up in the affairs of life, the playground bully, bad experience, getting fired at work, whatever it was. That stuff all impacts people as well. But I'd say about a third of it, roughly, comes from father wounds. So it's not insignificant at all.
No. And it is broadly affecting, right? I mean, even those that are, that might have experienced something from others that aren't related to them, typically can be tracked with people who don't understand how to live properly, which typically goes back to one of the parents. So it's certainly a big deal, and it comes up a lot. And it might be why you always hear that on Mother's Day, on the sermons and all that, it's always gloating about how wonderful mothers are. And on Father's Day, we're always told to do better as men and all of that sort of stuff, because we do seem to be the ones that inflict at least the most noticeable and obvious harm on people. And so, what would you say would be one of the most common areas of woundedness that people might suffer from?
In terms of father wounds?
Yeah.
Well, what's one of the most common? There's probably a handful of them, but in no particular order, I would say neglect and abandonment are on near the top of the list. Sometimes fathers bail out; they just leave, right? John Wimber, by the way, famously, his father took one look at him when he was born and then left.
Mm.
So abandonment can be a thing. Sometimes men, like John's father that I just mentioned, they basically run away from their responsibility. So that can happen. Sometimes abandonment happens because he finds another romantic interest. Sometimes abandonment happens because dad gets so wrapped up in his job that he doesn't really have enough energy or bandwidth to give to his own family. So maybe that one starts to move more towards neglect, but de facto, it looks like abandonment because dad's not around very much. And in fact, I'm thinking of one friend of mine who, by the way, is not a Christian. And his father was somebody who did a lot of international sales. And he told me when we worked together that his father would often be gone for months at a time, not just weeks at a time, months at a time, traveling internationally and whatever, and, being the big guy and all that. But that kind of thing leaves a child with it's not maybe communicated verbally. It could be, but it often leaves a child with the notion that I'm not significant. I'm not worth it. My dad thinks other things are more important than me. So those are common ones: neglect and abandonment. Another one, we already mentioned this, is violence, whether they've seen their mother get beaten, the dog get beaten, or they themselves were beaten, or they watched their siblings get beaten. It could be any or all. And sometimes there's no beatings going on. It's just that dad's always, I want my dinner hot, that kind of thing. And so there's that toxic masculinity. And, with that, that jangles the nerves. It shatters the internal composure of a child, especially a young child. And with that, they often don't feel safe. They feel like their world is spinning out of control and they don't really know where to land. And they also don't know what to expect, because at any moment, even if dad seems calm, he may fly into that other thing that I just described. Some fathers are highly misogynistic. And again, in an earlier generation, I think we were far less sensitive to this than we are today. So there could be the residue of watching mom or sisters be demeaned or belittled, and that carries over. So that can be a thing. Another way that people can be damaged by their fathers is, maybe they were trying really hard to do something, but they couldn't measure up to whatever that expectation was that their dad had. And so their dad ended up putting them down and criticizing them. Don't come home. Nobody who didn't hit a home run in the baseball game is fit to be my child. When you hit your home run, then you can come home. But until then, stay away. Well, dad, where am I supposed to go? I don't know. Stay at your friends. You're on your own. That sort of thing. So there could be that punitive behavior. Again, even if it doesn't involve explicit violence. There's some others, but anyway, that gives you a panoply of some of the common ones.
Right.
What kind of stuff do you run into?
No, very similar. Yeah, very, very similar on that. I mean, there's really, only a few problems that are expressed a lot of different ways. And, most of that is there. And what I've seen, and I'd love to hear what you think on that, is it does two things. It stunts our growth as humans and people, but it also stunts our growth and depth and relationship with the Father, our Heavenly Father, because I've seen it so often color, and it causes people to mistrust the goodness of God. It causes people, all of those things that you're talking about, they'll put it on him as though
right.
It's his issue as well. And so when you're walking with someone, I guess we can start thinking from a inner healing aspect. What kind of things do you typically do with folks in order to help bring some resolution?
Well, you can't address things that are not recognized. And so a lot of times we'll have perhaps protracted conversation just to get people in touch with the damage that they have experienced because of their father wounds. Again, in my life, my father was gone very early on. I know because my mother told me, I wouldn't even know how many times, over and over and over again. She told me that when I was born, my father wept and wept with joy. And he was so proud to have me as his son. Again, their marriage failed. But I will say this, when he died, they were on track to be remarried. So somehow they'd gotten things worked out. But anyway, he said he was very proud of me, and I was constantly told that. And I used to have a box of photos of him, and a few of them were of him and me. Those photos, unfortunately, were stolen in a robbery some years ago, and I didn't have negatives. They're irreplaceable. So I no longer have those pictures of my father. I literally only have one photograph that my cousin has given me. But beyond that, I don't have any even collateral. But I had this understanding that my father wanted, that he was thrilled to have me, and yet he left me, right? He died. Now, kids can't discriminate dad died versus dad walked out or rejected me. All they know is dad's not there. And for the longest time, took me many, many years to really even realize what I was feeling inside of me. But I often felt alone. I often felt like an outsider. I often felt, I don't know, somehow awkward. I was a little bit withdrawn. Some might have said aloof, but I wasn't. Aloof implies somehow that you think you're better than. I had no sense of that. It was just, I don't belong here. I don't fit. The in crowd, this is what these kids do. And, when they have vacation, they go skiing, or their fathers own boats and they go to the Colorado River. I lived in California. So they go to the Colorado River and they go water skiing, or they go up to Lake Isabella or Lake Arrowhead and they go water skiing. We never had any money to do anything like that. And so I often felt as though I was, second class, not that good. These were the lingering effects of the father wound that came from, in this case, neglect and abandonment. Again, not that my father chose to do any of that. He was dead. He was gone. But again, at a young age, you can't discriminate between those two things. You just simply feel these things. And so it took me quite a long time to even realize that was going on. Got a lot of prayer over it, inner healing type prayer. And of course, part of that was included forgiving my father for leaving. So, I ultimately, I think, got a lot of traction in that area. From time to time, I look at my life and I think, maybe I need to go get some more prayer for this. And COVID has made that harder. But with the world reopening, I may go back to my customary pattern of seeking annually to go on a retreat, not long, maybe 3 days, 4 days, to a prayer ministry center where I can put some of these things on the table and make sure we're addressing them in prayer, with the objective that they not get out of control and create a result that I don't really want to have.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So as far as people, like, if you, I think this will be fun to do. I know that a lot of times we'll talk about when we're talking about prayer ministry, and especially from a deliverance context, we'll talk about best practices where, if you see these things, it might result in these other things. What have you seen anything from a deliverance context, be it sickness, be it illness, or something like that, or significant kinds of oppression that might be tied back into some sort of a fathering wound that we've
Well, I think one of the biggest ones, and we're seeing it everywhere in society right now, and it's funny you're even asking this, by the way, because when I was in Mississippi last weekend, I had breakfast one morning with a friend of mine who is a psychologist, got his PhD out here in Los Angeles at Rosemead. He moved back to Mississippi after he graduated and has lived there the entire time. He and his wife, have raised their kids now, and so they're in that phase of life where the kids are grown and mostly married. But we were talking about our society, and he does a lot of work with the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. So think of FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is the MBI, Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. He also has his private practice, and he hangs around with some of the kind of prominent psychologists who are well known and well regarded within evangelical Christianity. Goes to many of their conferences, speaks with them, etc. And we were talking about some of the things we see. Me more from a prayer ministry standpoint, he more from a counseling standpoint. But he said, most of the problems that are going on here result from a lack of identity. And in that exact moment, he was referring to the rise and proliferation of alternate forms of sexuality. And he said, I see it over and over again everywhere I go, that today people have no idea who they are. And so they're open to anything because nothing's off limits, where they say, no, that's not who I am. They take anything on board. And he said, I see this as a direct result of the fatherlessness in our culture, because fathers help their children understand who they are, appropriate norms of behavior, boundary setting. And all of this, of course, needs to be in a way that's, it can be firm and clear and still be gentle and kind.
Right.
So we're not talking about, again, toxic ways of doing it. But he said, this is where all of this is coming from. And he said, especially among the younger crowd now, so I guess we would call them millennials, but he said among the younger crowd, he said most of them that are having all of these, this explosion of alternate sexualities that's going on in the 30 and under age group, it's because virtually none of them are being raised in homes that are intact with a father who is caring, who safeguards them and shows them the right way to live. He said, Dad is out of the home and our culture is imploding. And I thought, well, that about sums it all up.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty good answer to the question you just put to me. We could talk about some other things, maybe tactically, but at the broadest level, and it's, it's interesting. This is more of a discussion about fatherhood. It's not really a Bible study, but in the book of Malachi, it says that when the spirit of Elijah comes upon the land, and specifically this, Elijah returns, so a prophet carrying this heart, the hearts of the fathers will be turned back to their children. They'll no longer want to be away, even if work requires it. They'll no longer abandon them just because they found some other woman who's, now hotter than their wife that bore the children. They will no longer reject their children because they didn't measure up to some standard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in that, the hearts of the children will be turned back to the fathers instead of rejecting them, being embittered against them, hating them. There's a healing, there's a reconciliation, there's forgiveness for sure, but it's more than that. It's the rebuilding of a relationship that maybe was never there at all. And that will happen before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So I think the day of the Lord is coming. It's certainly closer now than when we first believed, as the saying goes. And so I would expect that with that said, that, as we move forward, I mean, society has got lots of problems, but I think the one that is not really being thought about nearly enough is the problem of fatherhood. Although I note with interest that Barack Obama, when he was president, he gave a major policy speech in which he said, today in America, we have a crisis of fatherhood. And, there's a lot of things that we could say about Barack Obama, but that would be one of the wisest things that he ever said.
Yeah, I agree. And, one of the things, even in extrapolating this conversation towards sort of a larger picture, but, Paul says it in Corinthians, you have a lot of teachers, you have a lot of, people that are instructing you. You don't have a lot of fathers.
Right.
And, even from a ministerial standpoint, you may have people that can teach, you may have people that can do that, but really the church is also hemorrhaging and lacking, godly fathers as well, to father those people that are in their congregation, and even in, we talked about this earlier this week with someone else about, even as we see those that are entrusted to us as staff or whatever, seeing it as more of a fatherly role than a practitioner or executioner or
Right.
or whatever, and we see that so often. And you have generations upon generations, even in the church, of people that don't know what it's meant to be fathered, what it's meant to be cared for in that way. And I think we're seeing the detriment in the church as well as the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, the church always reflects the society in which it exists. And many of those same pathologies are found in the church because either people don't leave that stuff behind when they come to faith, or even if they're trying to leave it behind, it's a process of coming out of it. Yeah.
So often you see a lot of the same problems that are resulting in father wounds can also be sort of manifest in church hurt, people that have been hurt by the church in a lot of different ways. It's also sort of another side of the coin of the father wounds.
That's it.
That take place.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
Yeah.
So, some other statistics, 90% of domestic abusers grew up in homes either with a domestic abusing father or no father. 92% of incarcerated men grew up in fatherless homes. 80% of violent offenders, not outside the home, but just violent offenders, maybe they're guilty of assault or murder or whatever, 80% of them grew up in homes without fathers. So the role of a father in stabilizing people, the role of a father in helping set guidelines on this is what's acceptable, this is what's not acceptable, you can hardly overstate it. And so to kind of bring it back around to where we started, I think Murphy Brown was quite wrong when she said that men are only sperm donors. I like to say that siring a child is an event, but being a father is a lifelong endeavor.
Yeah, and being someone that cares for people and all of that, it is a process and it is a journey, and I've seen fathers become fathers late in life, that maybe to their children, through the grace of God, they've been able to turn it around and come into the realization of all of that. But it certainly is it is a matter of utmost importance. So with those statistics and with all of that, for those that might be struggling from much of the absence of a father or abuse of a father or all of that, what would be something that you would tell them? How would you, if they could get your ear and you were counseling and praying and all of that sort of stuff, how would you lead them through in that?
Well, again, I'd want to talk about what indications do you have in your own life of the damage that you have, and different people are going to exhibit different things, but whether it's aggression, whether it's a sense of loss, misdirection, don't know what I'm doing with my life, trying to figure that out, even when I'm 30 or 35, this sort of thing. So I would try to identify those. I would certainly take them through a process of forgiving their father. And that, I say process because it's going to happen in that prayer appointment, but it may go on beyond the prayer appointment. There may be things that want to resurface. There may be new dimensions that arise, and oh yeah, I forgot about that one. I need to go back and revisit that. But at the end of the day, we want to get rid of all of the resentment. The scripture commands in Ephesians, fathers, do not grieve your children. Well, to grieve them means to wound them, to wound their conscience, to make them feel less than, insignificant, etc. So fathers, do not do this, is what the scripture says. So to the extent that we feel wounding, grieving, offense, resentment, I don't want to talk to my father, or I don't care if I see him, it's fine. I got other things to do. That's not a normal answer either. That's all that is protection and disengagement, lest you be hurt again because of something that he did or maybe wasn't doing. So I would want to walk them through a forgiveness process and encourage them as needed to do more of that. And then I would want to ask, do you have specific memories? The time, whatever, your father kicked the dog or slapped your sister or punched your brother or, disciplined you too severely or swore at your mother and, called her names and on and on. Do you have specific memories that particularly trouble you? And many times when people start to talk about these, they'll say, well, there was that time when and I've watched men do this too.
Yeah.
Because it's so traumatic. It's an interesting story. Part of it I need to omit because we are in a public forum, but some years ago when I was traveling in Australia, I prayed for a man whose mother used to write down his offenses as a boy while his father was away working in the mines. And this is a very common family structure in Australia. They call it FIFO, fly in, fly out. And it's not only fly in, fly out to your job, maybe go to the mine for 2 weeks and be home for 10 days, and then go back to the mine again for 2 weeks and then be home for 10 days. There's also FIFO fathering because you're not there all the time. And so his mother would write down all the things that he'd done wrong. And she would say, when your father gets home, you're really going to get it. And his father would come home and he just dreaded. He got to where he was shaking and was cold, literally with sweat, knowing his father was coming home because his father would come in. He would look at the list and he would get a frying pan and he would use it to beat his son. And after the beating was over, the kid could not go to school. Typically for 3 or 4 days, he was covered in bruises and he couldn't even sit down. He couldn't even use the toilet properly because he was so bruised around the buttocks and the backs of his legs. He couldn't sit on a toilet. Well, now that's an extreme example to be sure, but it's an example of the kinds of things when I'm talking about, do you have specific memories for which you need to forgive your father? And then, we invite the Holy Spirit in to cleanse those memories. We may invite Jesus into those memories to help soothe or comfort or, where were you in the memory? But we want to get people through all of that pent up emotion. In that story, it would be things like shame, anger, fear, all of that's pent up in those memories of when dad came home. It's interesting. This same guy told me that I think it was around his age 13. His father and mother, both of them were born again. And they became involved, as I remember it, I think it was an Assembly of God church, and ultimately became elders in that church. And he told me that his father had asked him repeatedly to forgive him for the way he was when the boy was younger. And yet that request for forgiveness was not the same as getting rid of the onboard emotion that was locked into his body, in his cellular memory, in the flesh of his body, and in his memory banks of his mind of when these beatings would occur. And so it's important if our fathers ask us to forgive them, and we should extend forgiveness if they ask. But that is not the same thing as releasing the emotion that you carry. So don't think saying, oh, I forgave him is enough. If you have damage inside of you, emotional, or if you had physical damage of some kind like this guy did, that all needs to be released into the presence of the Lord in order to fully get beyond it and find the freedom that Jesus intends for us to have.
Yeah, oh, that's good. That's good. And I know that you have quite a bit of resources on, primarily what we're talking about here is the inner healing model and all of that of walking through forgiveness that people can sort of check out and walk through that. I can't remember specific names, so people can find them.
Yeah, if they go to my website, which is www.orbisministries.org, So ORBIS, orbisministries.org, .org, not .com. If they go there and they go to the store that we have online, we have a series called Rediscovering the Ministry of Inner Healing. We have another one called A Primer on Inner Healing. Our integrated introduction to the integrated healing model will address some of this. Our intermediate healing series goes into it in fairly great detail. We also have some unusual titles along. One is called Dreams from My Father, and it has to do with being fathered and what it means to be raised as a father into fatherhood, I guess is the way to say it. And how we process the conflicts and things that arise from the fathering we've received. I have some other titles that are generally in the healing and inner healing section. They would be helpful to people as well, but those would be some of the first ones I would point people to.
Awesome, that's great. And I'm just thinking as we're walking through this, and we're closing out here, would you mind taking us through and helping, maybe praying for those that are listening that are finding themselves struggling for all kinds of reasons that they have?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we come to you and we thank you that the scripture shows us that you are kind and loving. Many of us have flawed understandings of you because our lens has been warped and twisted by our experiences with our earthly fathers. And your word says that all fatherhood in heaven and on earth derives its name from you, and that your intention, although we live in a fallen world, your intention is that we would understand you through the lens of our earthly fathers. Of course, Lord, because of sin, that often breaks down, and the lens we have is clouded or cracked, and we don't get the true and proper image of who you are. So, Lord, we just want to say that you are good, and you are good all the time. And Lord, even now, I know that there are people listening to us on this podcast, and they have damage in their lives. Their earthly fathers were harsh and severe. They may have been absent. They may have been womanizers. They may have been many things which damaged them. Lord, you call us to forgive. Jesus even said it on the cross. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And so it is with our earthly fathers. Many of them had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know how to father, and they didn't know the damage they were causing to those who are listening right now, to the children. And so our prayer, Lord, at this time is that you would bring to our memory those things, those incidents with our earthly father that we need to remember, that you would bring those things to mind even now so we can turn them over to you. And Holy Spirit, we got lots of people scattered all over listening to this. Some won't be listening to it at the same time as others. But we ask you to come down on those who are having these memories even now, that instead of memories of trauma, memories of shock, memories of terror and embarrassment, that you would bring in comfort. The word of God says that the love of our Heavenly Father is shed abroad into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, Romans 5:5. And so I'm asking you that you would pour into the hearts of all those who are listening the love that you carry from heaven to earth on our behalf, that we could be filled with your presence. And when we are filled with your presence, that we would experience that love from our Heavenly Father. Thank you for taking that love and making it ours. Jesus said that you would take what is his and make it ours. And he knew intimately the love that his Heavenly Father had for him. And so now, even as we're here and we've got these memories, we just want to release these things to you, Lord. And we want to say explicitly that we forgive our earthly fathers for their shortcomings, their misdeeds, and more. And we ask that you would heal our hearts and that we would walk free of the things that have bound us. We choose to do this, Lord, because your word tells us that we should. And because your word says that, we want to honor it and we want to walk in the freedom that you've promised to us. And so I ask you now that you would release over all those who are praying, that you would release over them that sense of love and affection that you have for them. And with that affection, they would find themselves oriented properly, and the identity that you ordained from the beginning of time would be theirs. Let it be so, Father. We thank you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Ken, thank you so much. And thanks for taking time to walk us through that prayer. And so we hope that you find freedom and find healing from that. Feel free to shoot us a message. You can give us, you can ask for different subjects. You can ask for things to talk about. And you can tell us some testimonies that hopefully will come from this. And that would be podcast@orbisministries.org. Until next week, which we'll be back with another fresh piping hot episode of God Is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. We hope that you all have a wonderful week. And Ken, thanks again for doing this with us. And thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Always a pleasure. God bless.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.